Hi everybody, this is Mom. Today we're going to make caramel rolls and frosted cinnamon rolls. The basic roll recipe is just yeast and milk, sugar, salt, eggs, oil, and flour. I'll show you how we'll put those all together. Okay, so we're going to start by proofing the yeast, which means we're going to measure the hot water and add some sugar and the yeast and let it set so that we can make sure that it's in good condition to rise. So we're going to need 1 cup of hot water. I use the hottest water I can get out of the sink. And then in the recipe it calls for 1 cup of sugar. So I just go ahead and use part of that 1 cup so I don't actually add extra sugar to the recipe. So I measure 1 cup and then I just sprinkle in a little, probably about a tablespoon or so, and then we'll save that rest of that sugar for later. Now the recipe calls for 2 packages of dry yeast. And I am doubling this recipe. So 1 package is pretty much, it's like 2½ teaspoons. So I put a scant tablespoon for each package. But for yeast, when you're doubling it, you only need to go 1½ times the yeast. So instead of adding 4 scant tablespoons, I'm adding 3, which is plenty good enough to make a good dough rise. So I'm just going to stir that in. And we'll let that sit a few minutes while we're measuring some other ingredients. So the recipe starts off with 3 cups of lukewarm milk. Now what I do is I measure 3 cups of water, which this is just the warm water from out of the sink, and I add that, and then I add 1 cup of powdered milk, which makes the 3 cups of milk. Now I have my cup of sugar measured here, what's left of it. I'm going to dump that in there. And then I'm going to measure 1 cup of powdered milk and add that. And so that will make the milk without having to use the more expensive milk you buy in the store. Now we add 2 teaspoons salt. I use just a scant teaspoon, means a little less than a teaspoon of salt. There's the 2 teaspoons. And then it calls for 1 cup of oil. Now what I've found over the years makes a better dough is 1/2 cup of oil. And I use 1/2 cup of butter instead of the other 1/2 cup of oil. It makes a better dough and better flavoring for the dough. So now I'm going to mix this together just a little bit, which mixes the milk and the butter is warming in this warm liquid here. Okay, that gave it a little bit of a mix. Now I'm going to add some flour because I don't like to add the eggs directly to the warm liquid because I don't want them to in any way start to cook. So I'm going to add some flour. Now I need 15 cups. I'll probably add about 5 at this point. So I added about 5 cups of flour. Now I'm just going to add the eggs right on top of the flour, which kind of creates a barrier between that and the warm milk. Okay, now before we start this up, we're going to add our yeast, which is looking very good. See how that has risen? It's almost over the top of the container. So now we add that also to our mixture here. It's almost like 2 cups of foam from the 1 cup liquid we started with. Okay, now I better put a lid on this so we don't get it all over the kitchen. And here we go. Now I'm going to add a few more cups of flour. Actually, flour in a dough recipe, bread recipe, doesn't really need to be measured. This scoop holds approximately a cup, so I just continue counting now. I had 5, that's 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And we'll put the lid on and let it go a little longer. Like I said, we're going on our way to 15, approximately 15 cups. So we'll see how it looks after we mix this in. So I'm just going to continue adding flour now until the dough becomes the right consistency. Cups of flour. It's beginning its kneading sound. As it brings the motors down, that's when the right kind of kneading is happening. So you want to hear that sound. It's still pretty sticky on the outside. I'm going to add another cup. This is a good consistency for kneading now, so we're going to let this go for 10 minutes. While the dough is kneading, I'm going to prepare the bowl it will rise in. So this is the biggest bowl I have, so this is the one I use. Just put a little bit of oil in it. It's probably about a teaspoon or so. But you just want a very thin layer of oil all over the bowl. You can just spread that around with your hand. And then later when the dough is ready, you put it in here and it won't stick to the bowl. So it has been kneading for 10 minutes and I'm going to check now, make sure it's actually done. When you stretch dough, if it's done being kneaded, it does not pull apart. This is a good dough. We're going to go on with the recipe now. So what we're needing to do is let this rise in our prepared bowl. So I'm just going to clean off the dough hook. Because I added plenty of flour, it's not extremely sticky, so that makes it easier to work with. Okay, now we just dump it in the bowl. There we go. That was easy. Alright, so now I just want to have a nice smooth surface on the top, and because it's oiled at the bottom of this, of course, is getting oil on it. So now I turn it, have a nice oiled dough, and it's ready to rise. I'm going to set the timer for 1 hour, and then we'll come back and check it. So the dough's been rising for an hour, and you can see that it's risen higher than the pan. I just wanted to mention that when I covered the dough, I also put a layer of plastic between, because that traps the moisture inside and helps it to rise a lot better. It gives it a nice warm and then moist condition to rise in. So there you have it. The way you check if it's ready is you just poke it. See how it stays dimpled in? That means it's done about all the rising it's going to do. So all we do at this time is just punch it down. We're just getting the air out of it, and again we're going to make a nice smooth surface. So I've just pretty much gone all the way around, and then I turn it upside down where it's ready to rise again. This rising will be between 45 minutes and an hour. I'll check it at 45 minutes and see if it's ready. See, now it bounces back. It's ready to rise. Okay, so now we're going to make the caramel for the bottom of the pan for the carameled rolls. We're just making enough for one pan, so I need 1 stick of butter. Which, oh, I'll turn on my burner here, about medium. We'll let that start to melt. And we need 1.5 cups of brown sugar. The way to measure brown sugar is to pack it. And I like to use the bag to push in. I don't get my hands all full of brown sugar that way. But I can feel in there the edge of the measuring cup, so I know that it's packed. So now the butter is beginning to melt. I like to wait till it's just a little bit more melted. While I wait just a little more, I will measure the 1/2 cup. And I level it off. And there you go. So the butter is melting nicely. It will continue to melt. I'm going to add the brown sugar. We also need 1.5 tablespoons of white corn syrup. So I'll just measure that right into here as well. And I don't need to get another measuring spoon dirty. It's not an exact science, so 1.5. Here we go. That should do it. Alright, so it will just continue to, butter will melt and the brown sugar will mix in and syrup, and then I'm going to stir this and then let it continue to cook until it's bubbling. Okay, so now it's bubbling nicely. We'll just stir that together a little bit, and everything's mixing together really well. It's a nice smooth thick caramel. Okay, so now we're just going to pour that in our pan. There we go. 9 by 13 pan. And just spread that out evenly. That's a lot of caramel, but that's the way we like it. So now I'm getting ready to roll out the dough to make our cinnamon rolls. Start off with just wiping the counter with a wet washcloth just to get a light coating of dampness there. And then we sprinkle flour over that part that was wet so we can roll out the dough without it sticking to the countertop. Alright, so let's check this dough. There it is, beautiful. This has been about 45 minutes and we're ready to form the dough. So we will take out about 1/3 of this and roll it into a rectangle. Okay. I can get a little flour on my rolling pin as well. So I'm thinking about 1/2 inch thick. I like to get it much longer than it is wide, but we do need some width because that gives us the size of our cinnamon roll. The length gives us how many we can make. That looks pretty good. Okay, so I'm going to cover up this dough that I'm not using because we don't want it to dry out. And the next step is we're going to put a thin, fairly thin layer of very softened butter on this dough. So we just spread it out all across the dough. That was probably about a tablespoon or just a little bit more. And that's just looking good. Alright, now I just cover the surface with cinnamon and sugar. This is a mixture I already had made up. Okay, now we just want to roll this, lift the edges carefully, and I brush any excess flour off because you really don't need extra flour in the cinnamon roll. And just kind of lift and turn. There we go. I like to pull the edges out so that the end cinnamon rolls are pretty much the same size as the middle ones. Okay, so I'm squeezing it a little in the middle, trying to make it all the same size. Okay, so now we're just going to cut straight down through this. It's like a tube of cinnamon rolls, and we make just nice slices like that. And I'm going to put it right on the caramel that's still warm, so this is going to rise very nicely. And there we just continue now to put a dozen in this pan. And that finishes our caramel pan. You can also put pecans or any kind of nuts in the caramel before you put the dough on, however you like it. So now we're going to put a tea towel over this and let it rise, and then we'll bake it. Okay, now we're going to prepare the pan for the cinnamon rolls. I have the butter wrapper that I took off earlier. It still has some butter on it, so I use that to butter the bottom of the pan. Just spread that out, and then the cinnamon rolls won't stick to the bottom. I'm going to continue cutting these rolls that I've already made, and I'll put them on this pan, and then I'll just roll out some more dough and continue adding them to the pan. One important thing to remember is to make your slices all the same size, because that's what makes the width of the cinnamon roll. And if you make them different sizes, like if it was a lot skinnier than this, they would burn by the time a thicker one would be done. So it's kind of important to try to cut them the same width. Alright, so now they're all on the pans, and we're going to wait for them to rise. I'd say about 20 to 30 minutes. Now the first ones we put on into the warm caramel, look how they've already risen. I'll leave them another 10 or 15 minutes and I'll turn the oven on. So we just need to remember to cover them so they don't dry out. And it also makes a difference what kind of a day it is. Today's a very warm day, so these are rising quickly. If it takes 35, 45, even up to an hour for this part to rise, it's okay. They'll still turn out just fine. Just allow them to rise enough. Okay, so now we are done with the carameled rolls rising, and we're going to put them in the oven, which is set to 375, and they will bake for 15 to 20 minutes. Okay, so the timer has just rang. And there we have some beautiful rolls. They're a little crowded. They've risen, but you know what? Those are going to be great. So for caramel rolls, you know the caramel's at the bottom. So looks like I need to loosen the edges a bit, and then I want to dump it out. So I want this to just fall right out of the pan, so I want to make sure there's nothing stuck to the side anywhere. It looks pretty good. I also want to do it fairly quickly while it's still very hot. So here we go, just dumping on the aluminum foil. I just use a little blade like that to lift the edge, and there's the nice hot dripping caramel. Don't get it on you, it's scalding. But I just scrape the pan out. Nobody minds a little extra caramel on their rolls. Just put it on the top and let it cool. So now we need to put in the cinnamon rolls. They've risen nicely, and we put them in for 15 minutes. Okay, so they are now done. They look beautifully golden brown, and we just get them out to cool. We'll be making the frosting for them after a bit. Alright, so now we're going to pull out the last pan, nice and golden brown, and here we have our day's baking. We need to let these cool before we frost them because, well, they would be delicious now with warm frosting, or the frosting would warm up and drip over them, but we're not going to eat them today, so we can wait and frost them at another time. So we'll make the frosting and then we'll frost them when they're cool. Okay, so while the rolls are cooling, we're going to make the frosting. Have a really nicely, almost more than room temperature butter here. It's nice and soft. 1 stick of butter, and then we have 4½ cups of sugar. This is powdered sugar. Just measure it lightly. 1, 2, and 2 teaspoons of vanilla. 1, 2. Alright, so now we mix it together. This still doesn't have milk in it, so it's going to be very thick. As for 2 tablespoons of milk, I usually use half and half. It's probably not going to be quite enough, but I'll mix it in and see how thick it is at this point. So there it is, pretty thick, really too thick for what we want. So I'm going to add another tablespoon and mix that in. Okay, so now it's a lot thinner. I ended up adding another 3 tablespoons of half and half. I like it to be so it's not real stiff. See how it's drippy. That's how I want it for my frosted rolls. Okay, so now I just want to frost the rolls. They're mostly cool. And you just slather it on. I like to still see the swirl of the cinnamon roll, so I do want to get, you know, about the thickness that will allow that to happen. Okay, so that's it for the baking day today. We're ready to have a treat for breakfast.